When most people think about serial killers, the same names come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These monsters have been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and Hollywood films. But there's a darker truth hiding in the shadows. Some of the most evil, most twisted killers in history have slipped through the cracks of public consciousness. Their names don't sell movie tickets. Their stories don't get told at dinner parties. But their crimes are so horrific, so methodical, so utterly depraved that they make the famous ones look like amateurs. Today, we're diving deep into the abyss. We're talking about the killers you've never heard of, the ones who operated in plain sight, who fooled entire communities, who turned trust into a weapon and compassion into a trap. These aren't just murderers. These are architects of human suffering who built their legacies on broken lives and shattered families. And here's what's truly terrifying about these cases. Each one of these killers had something that made them almost unstoppable. Fred and Rosemary West turned their own home into a house of horrors that operated for decades. Cary Stayner used his position of trust to hunt in America's most beautiful places. Peter Sutcliffe convinced an entire city that no woman was safe after dark. David Meerrhoer pioneered techniques that would haunt law enforcement for years. And Harold Shipman, he killed more people than any serial killer in recorded history while wearing a white coat and a smile. What makes these stories even more chilling is how these monsters hid in plain sight. They were the helpful neighbor, the trusted doctor, the park ranger, the devoted husband. They understood something fundamental about human nature that most of us never want to acknowledge. We want to trust. We want to believe that the people around us are good. And these killers weaponized that trust in ways that will make your blood run cold. Let's start with a story that sounds like it came from the darkest corners of human imagination, except it's real. It happened in Gloucester, England, in a house that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Number 25. Cromwell Street was a 3-story Victorian home with a small front garden and net curtains in the windows. Neighbors would wave to the family who lived there. Children played in the street out front. But inside those walls, something unspeakable was happening. Fred West was born in 1941 in rural Gloucestershire. From the outside, he seemed like a working-class man trying to make his way in the world. He was a builder, a laborer, someone who worked with his hands and came home dirty at the end of the day. But Fred West was hiding something that would eventually shock the world. He wasn't just a builder. He was an architect of horror, and his blueprints were written in blood. Rosemary Letts met Fred when she was just 15 years old. She was young, vulnerable, and desperate for someone to care about her. Fred was older and confident and seemed to offer her a way out of her troubled home life. But what she found instead was something far worse than anything she was running from. Rose wasn't just Fred's wife. She became his partner in crime so terrible that even hardened detectives struggled to process what they uncovered. The house on Cromwell Street became their hunting ground. But this wasn't random violence. This was systematic, calculated, and methodical. The Wests had a routine. They would identify vulnerable young women, runaways, hitchhikers, girls who wouldn't be missed immediately. They would lure them to the house with offers of accommodation, work, or just a place to stay for the night. Once inside, these young women discovered that leaving wasn't an option. What happened next defies comprehension. The Wests would torture their victims for days, sometimes weeks. They had converted parts of their home into what can only be described as chambers of horror, soundproofed rooms where screams couldn't escape, restraints built into the walls, tools that had been modified for purposes that go beyond what most people can imagine. And through it all, they lived their normal lives. Fred went to work, Rose took care of the children, they attended school events and neighborhood gatherings. No one suspected that their basement was a graveyard. The first disappearance that would eventually lead to their downfall was Heather West, their own 16-year-old daughter. In 1987, Heather simply vanished. The Wests told people she had run away to Wales, that she was working at a holiday camp, that she was living her own life. But Heather hadn't run away. She had discovered something about her parents that they couldn't allow her to share with the world. So they killed her, dismembered her body, and buried her in the back garden like she was nothing more than household waste. For years, this story held. Heather's siblings asked about her, but they were told she was happy, that she didn't want contact with the family. It wasn't until 1994 that cracks began to appear in the West's carefully constructed lie. One of their children made a comment to a friend about Heather being buried in the garden. It was meant as a dark joke, but the friend told their parents, who contacted the police. When investigators arrived at 25 Cromwell Street, they were expecting to find either nothing or perhaps evidence of a single tragic family incident. What they uncovered instead was something that would redefine their understanding of human evil. The garden yielded Heather's remains, but that was just the beginning. The house itself was a catalog of horror. Under the basement floor, they found more bodies. In the walls, behind false panels, more remains. Each discovery was more horrific than the last. These weren't just murders. The victims had been tortured, mutilated, and dismembered with a precision that suggested the Wests had been perfecting their techniques for years. Some of the remains showed signs of bizarre rituals. Fingers and toes had been removed. Bones had been arranged in specific patterns. It was as if the Wests had been conducting some kind of twisted experiment on human suffering. The investigation revealed that the killing had been going on for over 20 years. Young women would arrive at Cromwell Street and simply disappear from the world. The Wests had created a perfect system. They targeted victims who wouldn't be missed quickly. They disposed of bodies in ways that ensured they would never be found, and they maintained their cover so well that neighbors later said they seemed like the ideal family. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the West case is how they involved their own children in their crimes. The house on Cromwell Street wasn't just a killing ground. It was a family home where children grew up surrounded by horror. Some of the West children were forced to participate in the abuse. Others were victims themselves. The line between family and prey became blurred in ways that shattered every assumption about parental love and protection. When the full extent of their crimes became clear, the public struggled to process what they were hearing. This wasn't just about Fred and Rose West. This was about a systematic campaign of terror that had operated in plain sight for decades. Police estimated that the Wests had killed at least 12 people, but the true number may never be known. Some victims were never identified. Others were buried in locations that were never discovered. Fred West never faced trial. In 1995, while awaiting his court date, he hanged himself in his prison cell. His final act was one last attempt to control the narrative, to deny his victims and their families the closure that comes with justice. But his death didn't end the horror. Rose West was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She continues to maintain her innocence, claiming that she was as much a victim of Fred's manipulation as anyone else. The house on Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The city of Gloucester couldn't bear to let it stand as a monument to what had happened there, but demolishing a building doesn't erase the memories of what occurred inside. The West case changed how we think about serial killers, about the nature of evil, and about the dangers that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. What makes the West case so terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes, it's how long they got away with it. For more than 20 years, they operated with impunity. They raised a family, maintained friendships, and participated in their community while systematically torturing and murdering vulnerable young women. They proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Now, let's pull back the curtain on Cary Stayner, a man whose story demonstrates just how catastrophically wrong our assumptions about evil can be. While the world mourned his brother Stephen's tragic kidnapping and miraculous return, Cary was quietly nurturing something far more sinister in the shadows of his seemingly ordinary life. Cary Anthony Stayner was born in 1961 in Merced, California, into what appeared to be a typical American family. His father, Delbert, worked as a machinist. His mother, Kay, stayed home with the children, and they lived in a modest house on Bett Street, where neighbors waved hello and kids played in the front yards. But appearances, as we've learned, can be devastatingly deceptive. When Cary was 11 years old, his 7-year-old brother Stephen was abducted by Kenneth Parnell, a predator who held the boy captive for 7 years. The kidnapping shattered the Stayner family and thrust them into a nightmare that would define their lives for decades. The media attention was relentless. The community rallied around them, and every day brought the agonizing question of whether Stephen was alive or dead. But while everyone focused on the missing child, something dark was already growing inside his older brother. Cary later admitted that even before Stephen's disappearance, he had been harboring violent fantasies about women. He would sit in his room for hours, sketching detailed drawings of women being tortured and killed. These weren't the innocent doodles of a troubled child. They were methodical blueprints of brutality, carefully planned scenes of suffering that he would replay in his mind like favorite movies. The family's trauma became Cary's perfect camouflage. Who would suspect the grieving older brother of harboring murderous thoughts? Who would question the quiet, helpful son who seemed to be holding the family together while they searched for Stephen? Cary learned early that tragedy creates blind spots, and he positioned himself perfectly within those shadows. When Stephen miraculously escaped in 1980 and returned home, the world celebrated his survival and resilience. Books were written, movies were made, and Stephen became a symbol of hope and endurance. But for Cary, his brother's return brought a different kind of torment. The attention that had briefly shifted away from Stephen now returned with even greater intensity. Cary wasn't just the forgotten brother anymore, he was the invisible one, standing in the shadow of what everyone saw as a miracle. Stephen struggled to readjust to normal life after years of captivity and abuse. He married young, had children, and tried to build a quiet existence away from the spotlight. But in 1989, at just 24 years old, Stephen died in a motorcycle accident. The family's grief was unimaginable. They had gotten their boy back only to lose him again, this time permanently. For Cary, Stephen's death marked a turning point. The last barrier between him and his darkest impulses had been removed. His brother, the golden child, the survivor, the symbol of hope, was gone, and with him went any remaining restraint Cary might have felt. Throughout the 1990s, Cary worked a series of jobs that kept him on the periphery of other people's lives. He was a maintenance worker, a handyman, someone who could move through spaces without being noticed or remembered. He worked at a glass company, installed windows, and eventually found employment at the Cedar Lodge Motel near Yosemite National Park. It was the perfect position for a predator: access to rooms, keys, schedules, and most importantly, vulnerable people who were far from home. Cary was described by coworkers and acquaintances as quiet, reliable, and helpful. He didn't drink heavily, didn't use drugs, didn't get into fights or cause trouble. He was the kind of employee managers appreciated, someone who showed up on time, did his work without complaint, and didn't create drama. But beneath this facade of normalcy, he was carefully studying his environment, learning routines, and waiting for the right opportunity. That opportunity came in February 1999, when 3 women checked into the Cedar Lodge for what should have been a peaceful getaway. Carol Sund, 42, was a successful travel agent from Eureka, California. With her was her 15-year-old daughter, Julie, and Julie's friend, Silvina Peloso, a 16-year-old exchange student from Argentina. They had planned to spend a few days sightseeing in Yosemite before continuing on to San Francisco. On the evening of February 15th, the 3 women returned to their room after a day of exploring the park. They ordered room service, called family members to check in, and settled in for what they expected to be a quiet night. Cary, working his maintenance shift, had been watching them. He knew their room number, their schedules, and most importantly, he knew they were alone. Using his master key, Cary entered their room sometime after midnight. What happened next was a calculated explosion of violence that had been building inside him for decades. He bound and gagged all 3 women, telling them he was only interested in robbery, that if they cooperated, no one would be hurt. It was a lie he had probably rehearsed countless times in his fantasies. Cary strangled Carol and Silvina in the motel room, but his plans for Julie were even more horrific. He loaded her into Carol's rental car and drove deep into the wilderness, to a remote area where her screams would never be heard. There, he sexually assaulted and murdered the teenager before burning the car with the 3 bodies inside. But Cary had made a mistake. The fire didn't completely destroy the evidence. When the burned-out rental car was discovered weeks later, investigators found enough forensic evidence to begin building a case. The FBI launched a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of people connected to the Cedar Lodge and the surrounding area. Cary was questioned multiple times during the investigation, but his calm demeanor and apparent cooperation kept him from being seriously considered as a suspect. He expressed sympathy for the families, offered to help in any way he could, and even attended vigils for the victims. It was a masterful performance that might have worked indefinitely, except for one crucial factor: Cary couldn't stop. 4 months later, in July 1999, Cary struck again. This time, his victim was Joey Ruth Armstrong, a 26-year-old naturalist who worked at the Yosemite Institute. Joy lived alone in a cabin near the park, where she conducted educational programs for visiting school groups. She was passionate about conservation, beloved by her colleagues, and had her whole life ahead of her. On July 21st, Cary approached Joey's cabin under the pretense of needing directions. When she opened the door, he forced his way inside and attempted to sexually assault her. But Joey fought back with everything she had. She scratched, bit, and struggled so fiercely that Cary later admitted he had never encountered such resistance. In his rage and panic, he decapitated her with a knife he had brought with him. This time, however, Cary's composure cracked. A witness saw him near Joey's cabin around the time of the murder, and his behavior in the days following became increasingly erratic. When FBI agents arrived at the Cedar Lodge to question him again, Cary's carefully constructed mask finally began to slip. During the interrogation, Cary's answers became inconsistent, his alibi fell apart, and most damning of all, he knew details about Joey's murder that had never been released to the public. When confronted with this evidence, something inside him seemed to break. The secret he had carried for so long, the weight of his crimes, the decades of pretending to be normal, it all came pouring out. Cary confessed not only to murdering Joey Armstrong, but also to the deaths of Carol Sund, Yuli Sund, and Silvina Peloso. He described the crimes in chilling detail, showing no remorse for his victims, but expressing relief that his double life was finally over. He told investigators that he had been fantasizing about killing women since childhood, and that the murders were the inevitable result of urges he could no longer control. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Cary admitted that he had been planning these murders for years, possibly decades. He had studied the layout of the Cedar Lodge, identified potential victims, and rehearsed his methods countless times. The Sund Peloso murders weren't crimes of opportunity, they were the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. During his trial, Cary's defense team attempted to argue that his traumatic childhood, specifically his brother's kidnapping and death, had driven him to murder. They painted him as another victim of Kenneth Parnell's crimes, a collateral casualty of the trauma that had destroyed his family. But the prosecution successfully argued that while Cary may have suffered, millions of people endure trauma without becoming serial killers. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis linked Cary to all 4 murders. Witnesses placed him at the crime scenes, and his own confessions provided details that only the killer could have known. In 2002, he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. What makes Cary Stayner's case so particularly chilling is how perfectly he embodied the banality of evil. He wasn't a wild-eyed madman or an obvious predator. He was the helpful maintenance worker, the grieving brother, the quiet man who kept to himself but was always willing to lend a hand. For nearly 40 years, he lived among us, worked beside us, and fooled everyone who thought they knew him. The families of his victims were devastated not just by their losses, but by the realization that their loved ones had been murdered by someone who had seemed so normal, so trustworthy. Carol Sund's husband Francis, later said that what haunted him most wasn't just that Cary had killed his wife and daughter, but that he had looked him in the eye during the investigation and lied with such convincing sincerity. Cary Stayner remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he spends 22 hours a day in solitary confinement. He rarely grants interviews and has shown no remorse for his crimes. In the few statements he has made, he has expressed only relief that he no longer has to pretend to be someone he wasn't. His case serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, carries a maintenance uniform, and offers to help when you're locked out of your room. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed or lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes he's standing right next to you, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to reveal his true nature. The Stayner family tragedy didn't end with Stephen's kidnapping or his eventual death. It continued with the horrifying revelation that another son had been lost to darkness long before anyone realized he was gone. Two brothers, both destroyed by evil, but in completely different ways. One was a victim who became a symbol of survival and hope. On January 3rd, 1973, 16-year-old Susie Yeager was sleeping peacefully in her family's tent at the Headwaters State Park campground in Montana when she vanished without a trace. Her parents woke to find her sleeping bag empty, the tent undisturbed, no signs of struggle anywhere. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the mountain air. What they didn't know was that a man had been watching their campsite for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The search that followed was massive. Hundreds of volunteers combed through dense forests and rocky terrain. Search dogs picked up her scent, but lost it at a nearby road. The FBI was called in. Helicopters circled overhead for days. But Susie was gone, and so was her killer. For months, as the case went cold, another unsolved disappearance in the vast wilderness of Montana. But then something strange happened. Other young people started vanishing across the state. A pattern emerged that would eventually lead investigators to one of the most methodical and calculating serial killers in American history. His name was David Meerrhoer, and he had been perfecting his craft in the shadows of small-town America for years. David Meerrhoer was born in 1944 in Manhattan, Montana, a tiny farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business. On the surface, he seemed like any other small-town kid. He was quiet, polite, helped his neighbors with their chores. He had a steady job at a local lumber mill and lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. To his neighbors, he was just Dave, the helpful guy who would lend you tools or give you a ride when your car broke down. But beneath that ordinary exterior was something far more sinister. David had been harboring violent fantasies since childhood, fantasies that grew darker and more detailed as he got older. He spent hours planning imaginary crimes, studying police procedures, learning how to avoid detection. He wasn't impulsive or reckless like so many other killers. He was patient, methodical, and terrifyingly intelligent. The disappearance of Susie Yeager was not his first crime, but it was the one that would eventually unravel his entire operation. He had been watching the Yeager family for days, learning their routines, waiting for the right opportunity. When he finally struck, it was with surgical precision. He approached their tent in the dead of night, moving so quietly that even the family dog didn't wake up. He used chloroform to subdue Susie, then carried her to his waiting vehicle. What happened next was a nightmare that would haunt investigators for decades. David didn't kill Susie immediately. Instead, he kept her alive for days in a hidden bunker he had constructed beneath his property. The bunker was soundproof, invisible from the surface, and stocked with supplies that suggested he had been planning this for a very long time. He photographed her, tortured her, and eventually murdered her when he grew bored with his game. But David's greatest weapon wasn't his hidden bunker or his careful planning. It was his ability to blend into society so completely that no one suspected him of anything. While police were searching for a dangerous stranger, David was helping with the search efforts. He joined volunteer search parties, brought coffee to investigators, even offered to let them search his property. He looked them in the eye and lied with such conviction that they actually thanked him for his cooperation. This pattern would repeat itself over and over again throughout his killing spree. David would target young people, usually teenagers who were camping or traveling alone. He would stalk them for days or even weeks, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then he would abduct them, bring them to his bunker, and keep them alive for as long as his twisted fantasies required. The disappearances were scattered across Montana and neighboring states, seemingly random and unconnected. A teenage boy vanishing from a rest stop in Wyoming. A young woman disappearing from a campground in Idaho. Each case was investigated separately, with no one realizing they were all connected to the same killer. David was careful to vary his methods, his timing, and his locations. He never left evidence behind, never followed the same pattern twice. But David had one weakness that would eventually prove to be his downfall. He couldn't resist taunting the families of his victims. He would make anonymous phone calls to their homes, sometimes pretending to be their missing loved one, other times simply breathing heavily into the phone before hanging up. He sent cryptic letters to local newspapers, hinting at his crimes without revealing enough to get caught. These phone calls were his way of reliving the crimes, of extending his psychological torture beyond the physical acts themselves. He got a thrill from hearing the desperate hope in a mother's voice when she thought her missing daughter was calling home. He enjoyed the power he held over these grieving families, the knowledge that he alone knew the truth about what had happened to their children. It was one of these phone calls that finally led to his capture. In 1974, nearly 2 years after Susie Yeager's disappearance, her mother Sandra received a call from someone claiming to be her daughter. The voice was disguised, muffled, but the caller knew details about Susie that hadn't been released to the public. Sandra was devastated, but also suspicious. She contacted the FBI, who immediately began tracing all calls to the Yeager household. The technology for tracing phone calls was primitive in 1974, but the FBI was determined to catch this killer. They set up monitoring equipment and waited. When the next call came, they were ready. The trace led them to a payphone in Manhattan, Montana, just a few miles from where David Meerrhoer lived. They began surveillance of the area, watching and waiting for the caller to strike again. David, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly reckless. The long gaps between his crimes and the constant stress of maintaining his double life were taking their toll. He started drinking heavily, missing work, acting erratically around his neighbors. The careful facade he had maintained for years was beginning to crack. On September 29th, 1974, David made another call to the Yeager family. This time, the FBI was ready with better equipment and more agents in position. They traced the call not just to the general area, but to the exact payphone David was using. Agents rushed to the scene and found him still on the phone, still tormenting Susie's mother with his lies. When they arrested him, David initially denied everything. He claimed he was just a good Samaritan who had found the payphone and was trying to help the family. But when investigators searched his property, they found evidence that would prove his guilt beyond any doubt. Hidden beneath a false floor in his basement was the bunker where he had kept his victims. The walls were covered with photographs, detailed diagrams of his crimes, and souvenirs taken from each victim. They also found Susie Yeager's remains buried in a remote area of his property, along with the bodies of at least 3 other young people who had been reported missing over the past several years. Each victim showed signs of prolonged torture and abuse. The evidence painted a picture of a killer who had been operating for much longer than anyone had suspected. During his interrogation, David finally broke down and confessed, but even his confession was calculated and self-serving. He admitted to the murders, but claimed they were crimes of passion, that he never intended to hurt anyone. He portrayed himself as a victim of his own uncontrollable urges, a tortured soul who couldn't help himself. The truth, as revealed through his own journals and photographs, was far more disturbing. David had been planning these crimes for years. He had studied other serial killers, read books about police procedures, even taken correspondence courses in criminology to better understand how to avoid detection. Every aspect of his operation had been carefully planned and executed. The trial was a media sensation, one of the first serial killer cases to receive extensive television coverage. David maintained his facade of remorse and cooperation throughout the proceedings, but investigators who had seen his bunker and studied his journals knew better. This was a man who had found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others, who had turned murder into an art form. David Meerrhoer was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but he would never serve his sentence. On September 29, 1974, exactly 1 year after his arrest, David was found dead in his cell. He had fashioned a noose from his bedsheets and hanged himself, taking his secrets with him to the grave. His death raised more questions than it answered. Investigators suspected he had committed far more murders than the 4 he was convicted of. His journals contained references to other victims, other locations, other crimes that were never fully investigated. Some estimates suggest he may have killed as many as 20 people over the course of his criminal career. The case of David Meerrhoer changed how law enforcement approached serial killer investigations. It was one of the first cases where psychological profiling was used extensively, and it helped establish many of the protocols that are still used today when investigating similar crimes. His ability to blend into society, to maintain a normal appearance while committing horrific acts, became a template for understanding how serial killers operate. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how close David came to never being caught. If he hadn't made those phone calls, if he hadn't given in to his need to torment his victims' families, he might have continued killing indefinitely. The technology to trace phone calls was primitive, DNA evidence didn't exist, and communication between law enforcement agencies was limited. David was operating in an environment where a careful, patient killer could literally get away with murder. The families of his victims were left to grapple with questions that would never be fully answered. How many people had David killed? How long had he been planning these crimes? And most haunting of all, how many other David Meerrhoers were out there, hiding in plain sight in small towns across America? The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young people traveling alone, especially in remote areas where help might be hours away. David specifically targeted victims who were isolated, far from home, unlikely to be missed immediately. His crimes sparked a national conversation about safety and awareness that continues to this day. Today, David Meerrhoer remains one of the lesser-known serial killers in American history, overshadowed by more famous cases that came later. But to the families of his victims, to the investigators who worked tirelessly to catch him, and to the residents of the small Montana communities where he operated, his name carries a weight that will never be forgotten. Now let's turn to our fourth killer, someone whose name sends chills down the spine of anyone who lived through the horror of 1970s England. This man didn't operate from the shadows of a derelict city district or the isolated corners of rural America. Instead, he stalked the foggy streets of northern England, turning ordinary Friday nights into a reign of terror that would grip an entire nation for over 5 years. His weapon of choice wasn't elaborate or exotic, just a hammer and a knife. But what made him truly terrifying was his ability to vanish into the crowd, to blend seamlessly into the working-class neighborhoods where his victims lived and died. Peter William Sutcliffe was born in 1946 in Bingley, a small town in West Yorkshire, England. To anyone looking at his early life, there was nothing that screamed future monster. He grew up in a Catholic household, the eldest of 6 children, in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. His father worked as a mill worker, his mother kept house, and Peter seemed destined for the same unremarkable life that defined most men in his generation. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something was already festering. As a child, Peter was quiet, withdrawn, and deeply religious. He attended Mass regularly, served as an altar boy, and seemed to genuinely believe in the teachings of the church. But there were cracks in that facade, small glimpses of the darkness that would later consume him entirely. He was obsessed with death, spending hours in local graveyards, not out of morbid curiosity, but with what seemed like genuine fascination. He would later claim that he heard voices during these visits, divine messages that would guide his actions for the rest of his life. By his teens, those voices had become more frequent and more specific. Peter claimed that God was speaking to him directly, giving him instructions, preparing him for a special mission. To his family and friends, he seemed like a devout young man, perhaps overly serious about his faith, but nothing more concerning than that. He left school at 16 and took a series of manual labor jobs, digging graves, working in factories, driving trucks. He was reliable, punctual, and kept to himself. His co-workers described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who would nod hello and then disappear into his work. In 1974, Peter married Sonia Surma, a woman he had been dating for several years. She was a teacher, intelligent and ambitious, and those who knew the couple often wondered what she saw in the quiet, brooding Peter. Their marriage was troubled from the start. Sonia suffered from mental health issues, and Peter's increasing obsession with his divine mission created a tension that neither of them could ignore. But to the outside world, they appeared to be just another ordinary couple living quietly in a modest home in Bradford. What no one knew was that Peter's voices had become commands. He believed that God had chosen him to cleanse the streets of what he saw as immoral women, prostitutes, and anyone he deemed to be living in sin. This wasn't a sudden revelation, but a gradual descent into a twisted form of religious fanaticism that would soon turn deadly. He began driving through the red light districts of Leeds and Bradford, not as a customer, but as a hunter, studying the women who worked there, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first attack came in July 1975. Peter spotted a woman walking alone late at night in Leeds. He followed her, struck her from behind with a hammer, and left her for dead. She survived, but barely, and the attack was initially dismissed as a random mugging. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and Peter simply melted back into his ordinary life, returning to work the next day as if nothing had happened. But the taste of violence had awakened something in him, and the voices were telling him that this was just the beginning. 3 months later, Peter struck again. This time, his victim was Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4 who occasionally worked as a prostitute to support her children. Peter found her walking home alone after a night out in Leeds. He offered her a ride, and once she was in his car, he drove to a secluded area, struck her with a hammer, and then stabbed her repeatedly with a knife. This time, there were no survivors, no witnesses, just a body discovered the next morning by a milkman starting his early rounds. The police investigation was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. There were no fingerprints, no clear forensic evidence, and no obvious suspects. Peter had been meticulous in his planning and execution, leaving nothing behind that could trace back to him. He drove home that night, cleaned his weapons, and went to bed beside his wife, who never suspected that the man lying next to her had just committed murder. Over the next 5 years, Peter would kill 12 more women and attempt to murder 7 others. His victims ranged from prostitutes to students to women simply walking home from work. The common thread wasn't their profession or lifestyle, but their vulnerability, their availability, and Peter's twisted belief that he was doing God's work by removing them from the world. Each attack followed a similar pattern. He would approach his victims from behind, strike them with a hammer to incapacitate them, and then use a knife to finish the job. The brutality was shocking, but it was the calculated nature of the attacks that truly terrified investigators. The media dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper, drawing comparisons to Jack the Ripper, the infamous Victorian serial killer who had terrorized London nearly a century earlier. But unlike Jack the Ripper, whose identity remains a mystery, Peter was very much a part of the community he was terrorizing. He lived among his potential victims, worked alongside the men who were desperately trying to catch him, and attended the same pubs and social gatherings where his crimes were the topic of frightened whispers. The investigation became the largest manhunt in British criminal history. Police interviewed thousands of suspects, followed up on countless leads, and even received what they believed were genuine communications from the killer himself. But these communications, particularly a series of audio recordings sent to the police, would later prove to be hoaxes that misdirected the investigation for years. The real killer was hiding in plain sight, continuing his ordinary life, while the entire region lived in fear. Peter's ability to evade capture wasn't due to superior intelligence or elaborate planning. Instead, it was his very ordinariness that made him invisible. He looked like every other working-class man in northern England. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. He drove a common car, lived in a typical neighborhood, and maintained the same job for years. When police conducted house-to-house searches, Peter would answer the door politely, cooperate fully, and send them on their way, never once raising suspicion. The psychological impact of Peter's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. Women throughout Yorkshire changed their behavior, avoiding going out alone, altering their routes home, living in constant fear that they might be next. The entire region was gripped by a paranoia that affected everyone, from young women afraid to leave their homes to elderly men viewed with suspicion simply because they fit the vague description of the killer. Peter had succeeded in terrorizing not just individuals, but an entire population. What made Peter's crimes even more disturbing was the religious justification he used to rationalize his actions. He genuinely believed that he was doing God's work, that each murder was a righteous act of cleansing. This wasn't the rambling of a madman, but the calculated reasoning of someone who had completely twisted his faith into something monstrous. He attended church regularly throughout his killing spree, participated in religious ceremonies, and maintained the outward appearance of a devout Catholic while secretly planning his next attack. The end came not through brilliant detective work, but through a stroke of luck. On January 2nd, 1981, Peter was stopped by police in Sheffield with a prostitute in his car. He had been using false license plates, a relatively minor offense, but one that required him to be taken to the station for questioning. While there, he asked to use the bathroom and managed to hide the weapons he had been carrying, weapons he had intended to use that very night. But the false plates were enough to hold him, and when officers returned to search the area where he had been arrested, they found the hammer and knife. Under questioning, Peter initially maintained his innocence, sticking to his story about being a simple working man who had made a mistake with his license plates. But as the evidence mounted and the questioning continued, something inside him seemed to break. Perhaps it was exhaustion from years of living a double life, or maybe the voices that had guided him for so long had finally gone silent. Whatever the reason, Peter began to confess. The confession was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. Peter described each attack in clinical detail, explaining his methods, his motives, and his complete lack of remorse. He spoke about the voices that had commanded him to kill, about his belief that he was chosen by God for this mission, and about the satisfaction he felt after each successful attack. There was no emotion in his voice, no recognition of the horror he had inflicted on his victims and their families. To Peter, he had simply been following orders from a higher authority. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe became a media circus, with reporters from around the world descending on the small courthouse in London where his fate would be decided. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer who had terrorized an entire region for his own twisted pleasure. The defense argued that he was mentally ill, driven to kill by the voices in his head, and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense, finding Peter guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with a recommendation that he serve at least 30 years before being eligible for parole. But Peter would never taste freedom again. In 1984, he was attacked by another inmate and suffered severe facial injuries. The attack was seen by many as rough justice, a violent response to crimes that had shocked the nation. Peter survived but was left permanently disfigured, a visible reminder of the violence he had inflicted on others. Over the years, Peter's mental health deteriorated significantly. He was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital where he would spend the remainder of his life. The voices that had once commanded him to kill had been replaced by different delusions, but the core of his personality remained unchanged. He showed no genuine remorse for his crimes, no real understanding of the pain he had caused, and no desire for redemption. Peter Sutcliffe died in prison in November 2020 at the age of 74 after contracting COVID-19. His death was met with little mourning and no sympathy. For the families of his victims, it was simply the end of a long and painful chapter, the final closing of a wound that had never properly healed. For the people of Yorkshire, it was the death of a nightmare that had haunted their community for decades. The case of Peter Sutcliffe remains one of the most significant criminal investigations in British history, not just because of the number of victims or the length of time he evaded capture, but because of what it revealed about the nature of evil itself. Here was a man who appeared completely ordinary, who lived among his victims, who maintained relationships and held down jobs, all while secretly planning and executing some of the most brutal crimes imaginable. He proved that monsters don't always announce themselves with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. Now we turn to one of the most shocking cases in this entire series. Harold Shipman wasn't hiding in abandoned buildings or prowling dark alleys. He wasn't some drifter moving between cities under false names. Harold Shipman was a respected family doctor in Hyde, Greater Manchester. He had a thriving practice, a comfortable home, and the complete trust of his community. For over 2 decades, patients would walk into his office seeking healing, and many would never walk out alive. What makes this case so deeply disturbing isn't just the number of victims, it's the calculated betrayal of the most sacred trust in human society. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in 1946 in Nottingham, England. From the outside, his childhood appeared unremarkable. He was a bright student, academically gifted, and seemed destined for success. But there were cracks beneath the surface. His mother, Vera, was the dominant figure in his life, and their relationship was uncomfortably close. She was controlling, demanding, and had extraordinarily high expectations for her son. Harold worshipped her, and she made it clear that nothing less than perfection would be acceptable. When Vera was diagnosed with lung cancer in Harold's teenage years, everything changed. He watched her deteriorate slowly, painfully, over months. But what struck him most wasn't her suffering, it was the relief that came when doctors administered morphine. In those moments, he saw her pain vanish, saw her slip into peaceful unconsciousness. He became fascinated by the power of that injection, the control it represented over life and death. When Vera finally died, Harold was devastated, but something else had awakened in him during those long months of watching her fade away. Harold threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity. He excelled in school, earned a place at Leeds University School of Medicine, and graduated with honors. He was everything a medical school could want: intelligent, dedicated, and seemingly compassionate. His professors praised his bedside manner, his ability to connect with patients. He had a gift for making people feel safe, for earning their trust instantly. It was a gift he would later weaponize in the most horrific way imaginable. After graduation, Harold began his medical career in the early 1970s. He worked in various hospitals before establishing himself as a general practitioner. But even in those early years, there were warning signs that went unnoticed. He developed an addiction to pethidine, a powerful painkiller similar to morphine. He was caught forging prescriptions to feed his habit, but rather than ending his career, the medical establishment simply required him to undergo treatment. They gave him a second chance, never imagining what that mercy would cost. In 1977, Harold joined a group practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. He was charming, professional, and quickly became popular with patients. He had a way of making elderly patients feel heard, understood, cared for. He would spend extra time with them, listen to their concerns, and offer comfort in ways that other doctors seemed too busy to provide. Patients began specifically requesting to see Dr. Shipman. They trusted him completely, and that trust became their death sentence. What no one realized was that Harold had developed a twisted sense of purpose. He believed he could decide when someone's life was no longer worth living. In his mind, he wasn't committing murder, he was providing a service. He saw elderly patients struggling with illness, loneliness, or depression, and decided they would be better off dead. But it wasn't mercy that drove him, it was power. The power to play God, to control the exact moment when someone's life ended. His method was devastatingly simple. He would visit patients in their homes, often for routine checkups or minor complaints. Once alone with them, he would prepare a lethal injection of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. He would tell them it was medicine to help with their pain or symptoms. The injection would cause them to lose consciousness within minutes and stop breathing shortly after. Then Harold would calmly pack up his medical bag, call the authorities, and report that his patient had died unexpectedly but peacefully. Because Harold was a respected doctor, and because his victims were elderly and often already ill, no one questioned these deaths. He would sign the death certificates himself, listing natural causes: heart failure, stroke, old age. The families were grateful that their loved ones had died peacefully, without suffering. They thanked Harold for his care, for being there in their final moments. They had no idea he had orchestrated those final moments himself. The pattern continued for years, then decades. Harold's kill rate accelerated as he grew more confident, more brazen. He began targeting patients who weren't even seriously ill, people who came to him with minor ailments and ended up dead within hours. He killed patients in their homes, in his office, even in nursing homes during routine visits. Each time, he maintained the same calm, professional demeanor. Each time, he expressed sympathy to the grieving families. What makes Harold's crimes even more chilling is how he refined his technique over time. He learned exactly how much diamorphine to use for different body types, how to time the injections for maximum effect, how to position victims to make their deaths appear natural. He kept mental notes on which methods worked best, which caused the least suspicion. He turned murder into a clinical procedure, as routine as taking blood pressure or checking reflexes. In 1992, Harold left the group practice and established his own surgery in Hyde. This gave him even more freedom to operate without oversight. He built a loyal patient base who saw him as the ideal doctor, someone who still made house calls, who treated them like family rather than just medical cases. He was particularly popular with elderly women who found his attention and apparent compassion deeply comforting. They competed to get appointments with him, recommended him to friends, trusted him with their lives. That trust was exactly what he was counting on. Harold's victims came from all walks of life, but they shared certain characteristics. Most were elderly, often living alone, sometimes struggling with health issues or depression. He had a particular preference for wealthy patients, and investigators later discovered he had been forging wills and stealing from victims' estates. But money wasn't his primary motivation. It was simply a bonus. What really drove him was the intoxicating rush of controlling life and death, of being the last person his victims saw before they died. The sheer scale of Harold's crimes is difficult to comprehend. Over more than 2 decades, he killed at least 218 people, though the true number is likely much higher. Some estimates suggest he may have killed over 400 victims. That would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. But unlike other serial killers who operate in the shadows, Harold committed his murders in broad daylight, with the full trust and cooperation of his victims and their families. What's particularly haunting is how long he got away with it. Harold killed with impunity for over 20 years because he operated within a system built on trust. The medical profession, the legal system, even the families of victims all assumed that a respected doctor would never harm his patients. That assumption created a perfect cover for Harold's crimes, allowing him to murder hundreds of people without anyone suspecting a thing. The walls finally began closing in during the late 1990s. A local undertaker named Alan Massey noticed an unusual pattern. Harold's patients seemed to die at a much higher rate than those of other doctors. More concerning, they often died suddenly and unexpectedly, despite not being seriously ill. Massey shared his concerns with other funeral directors, and they agreed that something seemed wrong. But even then, no one wanted to believe that a respected doctor could be a killer. The breakthrough came in 1998 with the death of Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde. Harold had visited her at home for what he claimed was a routine checkup. Hours later, she was found dead in her chair. Harold signed the death certificate, listing old age as the cause. But Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was suspicious. Her mother had been in good health and high spirits just days before. More troubling, a will had surfaced, leaving Kathleen's entire estate to Harold Shipman. Angela demanded an investigation. When Kathleen's body was exhumed and tested, it contained lethal levels of diamorphine. The police finally had proof that Harold Shipman was a killer. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered a horror beyond imagination. decades of systematic murder by a man who had sworn to do no harm. The investigation revealed the full scope of Harold's crimes, victim after victim, death after death, all bearing his signature, all signed off by his hand. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Harold had used his position as a doctor to commit mass murder on an unprecedented scale. He had betrayed the trust of hundreds of patients, stolen their lives with cold calculation, and lived comfortably off their deaths for decades. When Harold was finally arrested in 1998, he maintained his innocence with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout his killing spree. He claimed he was being persecuted, that the deaths were all natural, that he was being scapegoated by a system looking for someone to blame. But the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. In January 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, Harold never admitted his guilt, never showed remorse, never explained why he had done what he did. He maintained his innocence until the very end. On January 13, 2004, guards found him hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used bed sheets to fashion a noose, timing his death so his wife could collect his full pension. Even in death, Harold was calculating, manipulative, thinking only of himself. The Harold Shipman case shattered public trust in the medical profession and led to sweeping reforms in how deaths are investigated and certified. It raised horrifying questions about how many other Harold Shipmans might be operating undetected, hiding behind white coats and medical degrees. It proved that the monsters we fear most aren't always strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the people we trust most, the ones we turn to for help when we're most vulnerable. Harold Shipman spent over 20 years perfecting the art of murder, using his medical knowledge and professional status to kill with impunity. He destroyed hundreds of lives, devastated countless families, and betrayed the fundamental trust between doctor and patient. He was a predator who wore the mask of a healer, a killer who hid behind a stethoscope. The story of David Meerrhoer begins on a quiet Tuesday morning in Manhattan, Montana in 1973. 7-year-old Susie Yeager was sleeping peacefully in a tent with her family during what should have been a perfect camping trip. When her parents woke at dawn, Susie was gone. No screams, no struggle, just an empty sleeping bag and a child vanished into the wilderness. What followed was one of the most chilling manhunts in American history, and it would reveal a monster hiding in plain sight. David Meerrhoer was the kind of man who blended seamlessly into small-town America. He was 23 years old, clean-cut, polite, and worked as a mechanic in Manhattan, Montana. Population barely 1,500. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked and children played outside until dark without a worry in the world. David lived with his mother, attended church regularly, and was known around town as quiet but helpful. When Susie Yeager disappeared, he was one of the first volunteers to join the search party. For 3 days, hundreds of searchers combed the rugged Montana wilderness. David was right there with them, hiking through dense forests, calling Susie's name, offering comfort to her desperate parents. He seemed genuinely concerned, even emotional about the little girl's disappearance. No one suspected that the man helping them search was the very person who had taken her. The investigation dragged on for months. The FBI was called in, Bloodhounds were brought from across the state. Psychics offered their services. But Susie Yeager had vanished without a trace, and the case grew cold. That's when David made his first mistake. On January 4th, 1974, nearly 6 months after Susie's disappearance, the Yeager family received a phone call. The voice was calm, almost conversational. "I killed your daughter," the caller said. The line went dead. The Yeagers were devastated, but now the FBI had something concrete to work with. They tapped the family's phone and waited. The calls kept coming, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. The caller would describe in horrific detail what he had done to Susie, taunting her parents with information only her killer could know. He seemed to enjoy their pain, feeding off their anguish like a parasite. But with each call, he was giving investigators more clues. What the FBI didn't know was that David Meerrhoer had been killing long before Susie Yeager. His first victim was a 19-year-old woman named Sandra Smolligan, who had been working as a babysitter in the area. She disappeared in 1967, 6 years before Susie. Her body was never found, and her case was written off as a runaway situation. David had learned early that certain victims wouldn't be missed as much as others. Between Sandra and Susie, there were others. Transients passing through Montana, hitchhikers who stopped in small towns for a meal or a place to sleep. David had a talent for spotting the vulnerable, the isolated, the people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive searches. He would offer them help, a ride, sometimes even a place to stay. They would trust him because he looked so normal, so safe. That trust would be the last mistake they ever made. David's method was chillingly simple. He would gain his victims' confidence, lure them to an isolated location, and then reveal his true nature. He wasn't driven by rage or passion like many killers. His crimes were calculated, methodical, almost clinical in their execution. He took his time, savoring the control he had over life and death. Afterward, he would dispose of the bodies in remote areas of the Montana wilderness, places so isolated that some have never been found to this day. The phone calls to the Yeager family continued throughout 1974. Each one was more disturbing than the last. The caller would describe Susie's final moments in agonizing detail, painting pictures so vivid and horrific that investigators had to take breaks during the recordings. But the FBI was patient. They were building a profile, analyzing speech patterns, background noises, anything that might lead them to the killer. The breakthrough came in September 1974. During one of his calls, David made a crucial error. In the background, investigators could hear the faint sound of a specific type of machinery, equipment that was only used in certain industries. They cross-referenced this with the caller's accent, his knowledge of the local area, and his ability to make calls at specific times. The net was closing. On September 29th, 1974, FBI agents knocked on David Meerrhoer's door. When he answered, they saw something flicker in his eyes, just for a moment. Recognition? Fear. But his voice remained steady as he invited them in for coffee. For 2 hours, they questioned him about Susie Yeager. David was calm, cooperative, even helpful. He had an alibi for the night she disappeared. He offered to take a polygraph test. He seemed genuinely puzzled about why they would suspect him. But the agents weren't fooled. They had been tracking those phone calls for months, and the evidence was overwhelming. When they arrested David, he didn't resist. He didn't deny anything. He simply asked if he could call his mother to let her know he wouldn't be home for dinner. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. During his interrogation, David didn't just confess to killing Susie Jaeger. He opened up about years of murders, describing each victim with disturbing clarity. He talked about Sandra Smolligan, about the transients, about others whose names were never even reported missing. He estimated he had killed at least 12 people, though he admitted the exact number was hard to remember. David described his crimes without emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. He explained how he chose his victims, how he gained their trust, how he disposed of their bodies. He showed investigators on maps where some of the remains could be found. Some bodies were recovered, others remain lost in the Montana wilderness to this day. What made David's case particularly terrifying was his ability to compartmentalize. By day, he was the helpful neighbor, the church-going son, the reliable mechanic. By night, he was a predator who stalked the vulnerable and defenseless. His mother later told reporters that she never suspected anything. His co-workers described him as quiet but normal. His customers trusted him with their cars, their property, sometimes even their children. The community of Manhattan, Montana was shattered. This was a place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, on being able to spot trouble before it started. The idea that one of their own had been systematically murdering people for years was almost too much to process. Parents who had let their children play freely in the streets suddenly kept them inside after dark. The sense of safety that had defined their small town was gone forever. David Meerrhoer was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, he continued to be a source of fascination and horror for investigators. He would occasionally offer information about other victims, but only when it suited him. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the power he still held over the families of his victims. On September 29, 1974, exactly 1 year after his arrest, David Meerrhoer was found dead in his cell. Some saw it as a final act of cowardice. Others wondered if he had been planning his exit all along, waiting for the anniversary of his capture to make his final statement. The case of David Meerrhoer remains one of the most disturbing examples of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facade. For years, he lived among his victims' families, attended their churches, shopped in their stores, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. He proved that monsters don't always lurk in shadows or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they live next door, smile at you in the grocery store, and offer to help you change a flat tire. The families of his victims were left with questions that would never be answered. How many others were there? How did he choose his targets? What drove him to take those final, terrible steps from fantasy to reality? David took those secrets with him to his grave, leaving behind only the echoes of his crimes and the shattered lives of those who trusted him. Today, the case serves as a reminder that evil can wear the most innocent faces. It challenges our assumptions about safety, about community, about the people we think we know. David Meerrhoer looked like everyone's ideal neighbor, but beneath that carefully constructed exterior was something far more sinister. Looking at these cases, it becomes clear that the most terrifying aspect isn't the brutality itself, but the systematic way these killers dismantled trust. They understood something fundamental about human nature that we desperately wish they hadn't. They knew that people want to believe in goodness, that we're hardwired to trust those who present themselves as helpful, caring, or familiar. And they weaponized that trust with surgical precision. Think about it. Harold Shipman didn't just kill patients, he built a reputation as a caring doctor for decades first. Every injection, every prescription, every bedside manner conversation was part of a larger theater. The Yorkshire Ripper didn't just attack women randomly. He studied their routines, their vulnerabilities, their moments of isolation. These weren't crimes of passion. They were methodical campaigns of deception. But here's what keeps investigators awake at night. For every killer we've discussed, there are dozens more operating right now. They're learning from these cases, adapting their methods, becoming more sophisticated. The internet has given them access to information that previous generations of predators could only dream of. They study police techniques, forensic science, behavioral profiling. They know what mistakes to avoid. The Fred and Rosemary West case revealed something particularly disturbing about how evil can become normalized within a family structure. Their children lived in that house on Cromwell Street for years. They heard the screams, saw the suspicious activity, witnessed the strange behavior, but it became their normal. When evil is gradual, when it's introduced slowly and systematically, people adapt to it. They rationalize it. They convince themselves it's not as bad as it seems. This isn't just about individual psychology. It's about how entire communities can be manipulated. Cary Stayner worked in Yosemite for years. Hundreds of tourists interacted with him, trusted him with their safety, relied on his local knowledge. Park rangers worked alongside him. He attended staff meetings, participated in search and rescue operations, even helped look for some of his own victims. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. What's even more chilling is how these killers often inserted themselves into the investigations of their own crimes. They would volunteer information, also offer to help with searches, attend vigils for victims. They fed off the chaos they created. The pain of the families became entertainment for them. The desperation of the investigators became a game. David Meerrhoer's case in Montana shows how isolated communities can become hunting grounds. Small towns pride themselves on knowing everyone, on being safe places where children can play unsupervised. But that very openness, that trust, becomes a weapon in the hands of someone who understands how to exploit it. Meerrhoer knew exactly which families to target, which children would be missed immediately, and which might not be. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal consistent patterns that should terrify us. They're often above average intelligence. They're patient. They're observers of human behavior. They can maintain facades for decades. Most importantly, they enjoy the process. The killing isn't the only source of satisfaction. The stalking, the planning, the manipulation, the aftermath, the investigation, the media coverage, the impact on families and communities. It's all part of their gratification. Peter Sutcliffe's case demonstrates how societal prejudices can actually protect killers. Because many of his early victims were sex workers, the investigation initially focused on that community. The police developed tunnel vision, assuming the killer must be someone from that world. They missed the broader pattern because they couldn't imagine that someone could be targeting women simply for being women, regardless of their profession or circumstances. Harold Shipman's method was perhaps the most insidious because it perverted the most sacred trust in our society. When someone is ill, vulnerable, frightened, they place their complete faith in medical professionals. Shipman took that trust and turned it into a weapon. Every time he walked into a room wearing his white coat, carrying his medical bag, speaking in that reassuring doctor voice, he was conducting a performance. And the final act was always the same. These cases force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that monsters look like monsters. But the reality is far more disturbing. Evil often wears a smile. It offers help. It seems trustworthy. It integrates itself into communities, into families, into institutions we depend on. And by the time we recognize it for what it is, it's often too late. The most chilling aspect of all these cases isn't just what these killers did. It's what they reveal about the rest of us. How easily we can be deceived. How our virtues can be turned against us. How our desire to trust, to help, to belong can become the very things that put us in danger. And somewhere out there, right now, someone is reading these stories, not with horror, but with fascination. Not with revulsion, but with inspiration. Not with sympathy for the victims, but with admiration for the killers. That's the truly terrifying legacy of these cases. They don't just represent evil that was, they represent evil that continues, evil that learns, evil that adapts. The monsters are still among us. We've seen how these killers operated in the shadows, how they manipulated trust, and how they exploited the very systems designed to protect us. But there's something even more chilling we need to confront. The uncomfortable truth that these monsters didn't just happen by accident. They were created, shaped, and enabled by a perfect storm of circumstances that allowed them to flourish for years, sometimes decades, before anyone noticed. Take Harold Shipman, the British doctor who became one of history's most prolific serial killers. Between 1975 and 1998, this trusted family physician murdered an estimated 250 patients, making him one of the deadliest individuals in recorded history. But here's what makes his story so terrifying. He didn't hide in alleyways or stalk victims in parking lots. He killed them in broad daylight, in examination rooms, while wearing a white coat and a reassuring smile. Shipman understood something fundamental about human psychology. We don't just trust doctors, we revere them. They hold our lives in their hands, and we surrender our most vulnerable moments to their care. When Dr. Shipman walked into a room, patients didn't see a predator. They saw salvation. He exploited that trust with surgical precision, turning medicine into murder. His method was almost elegant in its simplicity. Diamorphine, a powerful painkiller administered in lethal doses. To families, it looked like their loved one had simply passed away peacefully. To coroners, the deaths appeared natural. Elderly patients, after all, were expected to die. Shipman had found the perfect cover, hiding his murders behind the natural order of life and death. But what's truly disturbing is how the system protected him. When other medical professionals noticed unusually high death rates among Shipman's patients, they were dismissed. When families questioned sudden deaths, they were told it was grief talking. The medical establishment, so invested in protecting its own reputation, couldn't fathom that one of their own had become a serial killer. The numbers are staggering. Over 2 decades, Shipman killed more people than some armies. He destroyed entire families, robbed communities of their elders, and perverted the very oath he had sworn to uphold. Yet he continued practicing, continued killing, protected by a system that valued professional courtesy over patient safety. It wasn't until 1998 that the truth finally emerged. A fellow doctor, Linda Reynolds, noticed that Shipman's patients were dying at an alarming rate. But even then, her concerns were initially ignored. It took the suspicious death of Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy widow who had suddenly changed her will to leave everything to Shipman, before authorities finally took notice. When they exhumed Grundy's body, they found lethal levels of diamorphine. The investigation that followed revealed a killing spree that had lasted over 2 days. Shipman had murdered patients in their homes, in his office, even in nursing homes. He had targeted the elderly, the lonely, the vulnerable, people who trusted him completely. The psychological profile that emerged was chilling. Shipman wasn't motivated by money, though he occasionally forged wills. He wasn't driven by sexual gratification or personal revenge. He killed because he enjoyed the power over life and death. He played God, deciding who lived and who died, and he did it with the full authority of the medical profession behind him. During his trial, Shipman maintained his innocence, even as the evidence mounted against him. 15 murders were proven in court, but investigators believe the true number was far higher. Some estimates suggest he may have killed over 400 people, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in history. What makes Shipman's case so terrifying isn't just the scale of his crimes, but what it reveals about institutional blindness. The medical community, so focused on protecting its reputation, failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. Warning signs were ignored, concerns were dismissed, and a killer was allowed to operate freely for over 2 decades. This pattern of institutional protection isn't unique to Shipman. We see it repeated across all the cases we've examined. The Wests operated for years while social services failed to protect the children in their care. Sutcliffe continued his killing spree while police focused on the wrong suspect. Stayner murdered tourists while his employers ignored the warning signs. Meerrhoer terrorized a community while law enforcement struggled to connect the dots. These aren't isolated failures. They represent a systematic problem with how we identify and respond to predators in our midst. We create systems of trust, authority, and protection, but we fail to account for the fact that these same systems can be exploited by those who understand how to manipulate them. The most dangerous killers aren't the ones who operate outside society. They're the ones who embed themselves within it, who understand its rules and exploit its weaknesses. They become the helpful neighbor, the trusted doctor, the dedicated employee, the caring family man. They weaponize our desire to trust, to believe in the goodness of others, to assume that people in positions of authority have our best interests at heart. Consider how many warning signs were missed across all these cases. Shipman's unusually high death rates, the West's history of child abuse, Sutcliffe's resemblance to witness descriptions, Stayner's troubled behavior, Meerrhoer's suspicious presence at crime scenes. In each case, people noticed something was wrong, but the system failed to act on those observations. This failure isn't accidental, it's structural. We've built institutions that prioritize stability over scrutiny, that value professional courtesy over public safety, that assume good intentions until proven otherwise. These aren't necessarily bad principles, but they create blind spots that predators can exploit. The victims of these killers weren't just random casualties, they were systematically chosen for their vulnerability, their isolation, their lack of powerful advocates. The elderly patients who trusted Shipman, the runaway teenagers who fell into the West's trap, the women who crossed paths with Sutcliffe in the dark, the hitchhikers who accepted rides from Stayner, the children who encountered Meerrhoer in their small town. These killers understood something crucial about victim selection. They targeted people who wouldn't be missed quickly, whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate alarm, whose deaths could be explained away or ignored. They preyed on society's most vulnerable members, knowing that the system would be slow to respond, if it responded at all. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these cases is how they reveal the banality of evil. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, who decided that their desires mattered more than other people's lives, who convinced themselves that their victims deserved what was happening to them. They lived among us, worked alongside us, smiled at us in the grocery store. They attended community events, maintained relationships, performed acts of apparent kindness. They were, in every visible way, normal. And that's what makes them so terrifying. Because if they could hide in plain sight, if they could fool everyone around them for years or decades, then how many others are out there right now, waiting for the right opportunity? The answer to that question is what should keep us awake at night. Because the truth is, we don't know. We can't know. The very nature of these predators is that they're invisible until they choose to reveal themselves, or until circumstances force them into the light. The reality is that these killers didn't just disappear after their arrests. Their legacy of terror lives on, woven into the fabric of the communities they destroyed. Take Harold Shipman, for instance. Even after his conviction, families across Greater Manchester were left questioning every death he had been involved with. Medical records were scrutinized, exhumed bodies told new stories, and the very foundation of trust between patients and doctors cracked under the weight of his betrayal. The ripple effects spread through the healthcare system like a virus, forcing hospitals and clinics to implement safeguards that shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. But what's even more disturbing is how these monsters managed to hide in plain sight for so long. They weren't lurking in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They were sitting at dinner tables, attending community meetings, working alongside colleagues who considered them friends. Fred West ran a construction business, hired local workers, and was known around Gloucester as someone who could fix your roof or build an extension. His neighbors saw him as helpful, maybe a bit rough around the edges, but fundamentally harmless. They had no idea that beneath his house lay a graveyard of young women, some of whom they might have known personally. The psychological aftermath for survivors and families is something that never truly heals. When David Meerrhoer was finally caught, the parents of his victims didn't feel relief. They felt rage, confusion, and a hollow emptiness that no conviction could fill. How do you process the fact that your child's killer was someone you might have nodded to at the grocery store? Someone who seemed so ordinary that they blended seamlessly into the background of everyday life. The families were left with questions that had no satisfying answers, wounds that couldn't be stitched closed with a guilty verdict. And then there are the near misses, the potential victims who escaped death by pure chance. Cary Stayner had been stalking other women in the Yosemite area for months before he finally struck. Park rangers later discovered that he had been watching, following, and planning attacks on visitors who never knew how close they came to becoming his next victims. Some of these women only learned of their brush with death years later, when investigators pieced together his movements and revealed the full scope of his predatory behavior. Imagine living your life normally, only to discover that a serial killer had been watching you, planning your murder, and you escaped only because something distracted him or changed his mind. The institutional failures that allowed these killers to operate are perhaps the most infuriating aspect of their stories. Peter Sutcliffe was questioned by police multiple times during his killing spree. He was pulled over, interviewed, and released because officers couldn't connect the dots that were right in front of them. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation became a case study in how prejudice, tunnel vision, and bureaucratic incompetence can literally cost lives. Women continued to die while police chased false leads and ignored evidence that could have stopped Sutcliffe years earlier. What makes these cases even more chilling is how they reveal the banality of evil. These weren't masterminds or criminal geniuses. They were ordinary people who made a choice to cross a line that most of us can't even imagine approaching. Harold Shipman didn't kill because he was particularly clever or skilled at avoiding detection. He killed because he held a position of trust that gave him access to vulnerable people, and because the system was designed to trust doctors implicitly. His ordinariness was his greatest weapon. The communities where these killers operated were forever changed. Gloucester became synonymous with the West murders. The Yorkshire region couldn't shake the shadow of the Ripper. Small Montana towns like those where David Meerrhoer hunted were stripped of their innocence, their sense of safety shattered by the realization that evil could emerge from anywhere, even from someone you'd known for years. These places lost something intangible but vital, a kind of communal trust that can never be fully restored. Even more disturbing is how these killers often targeted society's most vulnerable members. The West preyed on troubled teenagers, runaways, and young women who wouldn't be immediately missed. Shipman chose elderly patients whose deaths could be easily explained away. They understood instinctively that the system cared less about certain victims, and they exploited that callous reality to continue their killing sprees undetected. Their victim selection wasn't random. It was calculated, predatory, and designed to minimize the chances of being caught. The investigation processes themselves became secondary traumas for the families involved. When authorities finally began excavating the West House, families were forced to relive their losses in the most public and horrific way possible. Every new discovery brought fresh anguish. Every news report reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The media circus that surrounded these cases often treated the victims as footnotes to the larger story of the killers themselves, reducing real people with full lives and dreams to mere statistics in a catalog of horror. What's perhaps most unsettling is how these killers maintained relationships and friendships even while actively murdering. They went to work, paid bills, had conversations about mundane topics, all while harboring secrets that would have horrified anyone who knew them. This compartmentalization reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychology: the ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, to present one face to the world while hiding something monstrous underneath. The true horror isn't just in what these killers did, but in how easily they moved through society, how long they went undetected, and how many people they encountered who never suspected the darkness they carried. They prove that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. It wears a familiar face, speaks in a friendly voice, and offers help when you need it most. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey through the minds of humanity's darkest predators, one unsettling truth emerges: evil rarely announces itself with fanfare or warning signs. Instead, it whispers quietly in suburban kitchens, smiles behind medical masks, and walks undetected through our communities for decades. Fred and Rosemary West transformed their family home into a house of horrors, burying their victims beneath the very foundations where their children played. Their ability to compartmentalize such brutality while maintaining the facade of ordinary family life reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychology. Neighbors heard nothing, friends suspected nothing. The system failed repeatedly to protect the vulnerable young women who disappeared into that nightmare on Cromwell Street. Cary Stayner spent years crafting the perfect image of a helpful maintenance worker and nature lover, all while harboring fantasies of violence that would eventually explode into the brutal murders that shattered Yosemite's peaceful reputation. His crimes remind us that trauma doesn't excuse evil, and that some wounds in the human psyche can fester until they become something monstrous. Peter Sutcliffe stalked the streets of Yorkshire for half a decade, his hammer and knife claiming 13 lives, while police chased false leads and dismissed crucial evidence. The investigation's failures weren't just procedural, they were moral. The assumption that some victims mattered less than others allowed a killer to operate with impunity, targeting women whose deaths were seen as somehow less tragic because of their circumstances. David Meerrhoer brought terror to the quiet mountains of Montana, proving that no community is too small or too remote to harbor evil. His methodical stalking of families, his calculated abductions, and his psychological torture of parents searching for their children demonstrate how predators exploit the very trust that holds small communities together. And perhaps most chilling of all, Harold Shipman weaponized the sacred trust between doctor and patient, turning healing into murder on an industrial scale. For decades, he decided who lived and who died, playing God with a syringe full of morphine while families thanked him for his compassion. His crimes represent the ultimate betrayal of human vulnerability. These killers shared common threads that should terrify us all. They understood instinctively how to manipulate the systems designed to protect us. They recognized that society's most vulnerable members make the easiest targets. They knew that ordinary appearances provide the perfect camouflage for extraordinary evil. Most disturbing of all, they counted on our collective reluctance to believe that such monsters could exist among us. The West children grew up thinking their parents' violence was normal. Police officers dismissed evidence because it didn't fit their preconceptions. Medical colleagues praised Shipman's dedication while he murdered their patients. Entire communities lived alongside these predators, never suspecting the truth that was hiding in plain sight. This isn't just about individual evil, it's about systemic failure. It's about how institutions can become complicit through negligence, prejudice, and willful blindness. It's about how societies create the very conditions that allow predators to thrive by devaluing certain lives, by refusing to listen to inconvenient truths, and by prioritizing reputation over protection. The victims of these crimes weren't just statistics or case studies. They were daughters who never came home, patients who trusted their doctor, children who should have been safe in their own beds. Each life stolen represents countless ripple effects, families destroyed, communities traumatized, and trust shattered on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. What makes these stories even more haunting is how they reveal the banality of evil. These weren't comic book villains or Hollywood monsters. They were people who went to work, who had neighbors, who seemed unremarkable in every way except for the darkness they carried inside. They prove that evil doesn't need to look evil to be devastating. The most unsettling realization is that cases like these are still happening. Right now, somewhere, another predator is perfecting their facade. Another institution is failing its most vulnerable members. Another community is choosing to look the other way rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. The patterns repeat because we haven't learned the lessons these tragedies should have taught us. But perhaps that's why these stories matter, not as entertainment or shock value, but as warnings. They remind us to question authority when something feels wrong. They teach us that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem most trustworthy. They show us that evil flourishes in silence and dies in the light of truth. The families who survived these killers, the investigators who finally brought them to justice, the journalists who refused to let their stories be forgotten, they all understood something crucial, that remembering the victims and exposing the truth is the only way to honor those who were lost and protect those who might be next. These aren't just stories about serial killers. They're stories about us, about our societies, about the choices we make when faced with uncomfortable truths. They're about the price of looking away, the cost of assuming someone else will act, and the devastating consequences when systems fail the people they're meant to protect. The monsters are gone now, dead or imprisoned, but their legacy lives on in the lessons they left behind. In the end, the most fitting tribute to their victims isn't to forget, but to remember, to stay vigilant, to listen when someone says they're afraid, to believe the unbelievable when evidence demands it, and to never again allow evil to hide behind the mask of normalcy while innocent people pay the price for our willful blindness. Because somewhere out there, another predator is counting on our complacency. Another victim is hoping someone will notice they're in danger. And another community is about to learn that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that look like monsters at all.